Hi everyone, welcome to the second video in the Almost Snow Day video series that we're doing for today in lieu of class. In the first video, I talked a lot about administrative stuff, how to submit your homework that's due at 11:59 p.m. tonight. You have the Google Doc discussion questions and the cliche worksheet. The cliche worksheet is due via email to me again by 11:59 p.m. tonight. So this video is going to cover a couple of things that are on our themes for today, which are arc, plot, conflict, and cliches. So we're going to talk about how to include this in your writing and how to prevent these. To recap, we have discussed introductions and first line / first paragraphs in a couple of different readings that we've had, specifically Plath's The Bell Jar, the first paragraph of that, and James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. We talked a little bit about setting role building in Harrison Bergeron by Vonnegut. And of course, these two questions I'm going to reiterate throughout the semester. What do you need to say in your life, in your writing, in this course, and what resources do you need to say it? Do you need time? Do you need anything from me? Like, I've already met with one student. We talked a lot about the stories that she had written in the past and how to revamp them for this course and for publication in the future. I have created a terms sheet that we will touch on all semester. We'll put it online, and basically these are the things. You don't have to memorize these by any means, but these are the things that are bolded in the Gwen reading. You might have noticed a bunch of terms here, so like novella, frame tale. Hopefully a few of these are familiar to you, but if they're not, bring those questions with you to class on Friday. A couple of them might be how is something that's a parable different from something that's didactic. That could be a question that you could have for your QQTP, even though that's mainly geared toward Bolt in the Brain. But if you really have a burning question about some of these terms or the Gwen reading, please don't hesitate to ask. So this is something that might come more into play during finals week when you are working on your critical preface for your final portfolio. So I've already tried to put everything in one spot for you guys, and again, we'll touch on these throughout the semester. So if you have any questions about the Gwen piece, please, again, don't hesitate to ask. A lot of it is common knowledge about storytelling, oral tradition. Hopefully it gave you a good background about the trajectory of the story and even of the novel as you all enter that tradition with your own writing. So I'm not asking you to change the world by any means or rock the tradition of literary history, but if you can add to it in some way and in an educated way, that is the goal. All right, so with cliches, I have that worksheet for you guys, and I want you to fill that out on your own time. But I see a lot of these in writing, and specifically in young writing, and I also, as a writer, have to prevent myself from relying on cliches. So you might ask yourself the first question, what is a cliche? If you're a native English speaker, which most of you are, idioms, cliches, figurative language, and tropes are all very similar. They fall under kind of the category of figurative language as a larger umbrella term. I've taught ESL a lot, and so defining the distinctions between cliches and idioms and tropes or stereotypes even, those all are very similar. They're all kind of like cousins. So cliches, they are so integral into our writing and into advertising, marketing, everything, that they probably are not noticeable or as noticeable to you all when you are watching a commercial or reading something. I want you to start to notice them. So I've included a couple here I just went over in the other video, but think about the ones that you may hear yourself saying a lot. I think it's completely fine for you to say them, but in your writing, I think they should be purposeful and almost innovative. So think about how Woolf uses tropes in Bullet in the Brain, the bank robbing tropes, and think about how other things that you may have read have cliches. And then I have this question here, which helps us think about when cliches are useful and when they are not. What's the difference between literary fiction and commercial fiction? So in this class, we're striving for literary fiction. And that just means we are not producing those kind of manufactured novels, as I may have mentioned, like the John Grisham, James Patterson, can't remember his name. Those obviously sell well, the Clancy novels, all of that. But they are not necessarily the best, the most well written, and you can probably attest to that if you've ever read a few of them. They have interesting plots and they capture the imaginations of mass audiences, but they're kind of replicas of each other and they don't stand out. So we can talk about the value and the benefit of both of these types. Literary fiction is pretty much what we're going to read and hopefully produce throughout the semester. There are some people who cross over. I would place Stephen King and Margaret Atwood and even Cormac McCarthy in both categories. But it's pretty much, if you are strictly commercial, you are mass producing a lot of the same thing, essentially. So I bring this up because cliches work really well in commercial fiction, and that's because the public can rely on something familiar and something basically ordinary. In literary fiction, it challenges audiences to think differently and to think beyond what's familiar. So you might have familiar elements, but they're going to be tweaked and nuanced in new ways that challenge the reader beyond commercial fiction. And that's kind of my whole spiel about cliches. Let's move on then to arc, plot, and conflict. And I have a couple of questions. In the class, of course, I would just ask you guys the questions or put you in groups, and we would have a discussion about them. Unfortunately, because of weather or, Morgantown, traffic, roads, etc., we're going to just go through these briefly, and then hopefully if you have anything that you really want to bring up about Bullet in the Brain, because it is such a good short story. It's I read it when I was an undergrad in my actually short story class. I was taking as, I think, a junior or sophomore when I was at undergrad. I fell in love with it, and now I obviously teach it. So let's think about how Tobias Wolff plays with tropes in Bullet in the Brain. That I will read your responses to in your cliche worksheet. So I'm going to skip to question 2. What questions do you have about this reading? Why is it important to discuss? For me, this reading is important to discuss not only because it represents a challenging of tropes, but also the ending section is one of the best endings that I think I've ever read. And Anders, as a character, he's definitely a bit of a, excuse my language, but douchebag. Like he's kind of a tool, but he's so interesting as a character. So that brings up the question that a couple of you have written about Harrison Bergeron is the value of having a likable or dislikable character. And both of those are better than having a character that is blah or indifferent, or pretty much every romance character or romantic character in rom-coms or like Nicholas Sparks characters that, and I'm not, bashing Nicholas Sparks, but he does write more in the commercial fiction side, what we've talked about above. So it's almost too familiar and I'm not challenged by it. So Anders is a really great character to discuss, and kind of his reaction to the bank robbers. And then that final scene, I think, is just one of the best endings. It's the most memorable that I can think of. So do you guys think that Wolff's piece follows a traditional story arc? And in that question is an assumption of what is a traditional story arc. So typically, and I would draw on the board at this point, the story arc, as your reading described, has that rising conflict or rising action, and then the introduction, the details, then the rising conflict, rising action, then you get to the apex of your diagram, and that's the climax, right, where everything comes to a head, cliche, and then you have the resolution or the denouement, and a lot of stories, most fiction follows this pattern. Nonfiction, you have a lot of different kinds of essays you can write, and poetry is just this whole other beast, essentially. So fiction, there are actually, someone mentioned the first day when I asked what is fiction is free, and I almost would go against that and say fiction has more expectations. We are required, especially in short stories, if the author directs our attention to a gun on the table or a pen on the table or whatever, we're expecting that prop to be used. It's very pointed and pieced together. So we'll talk a little bit more about how to challenge this and if we want to challenge it. But again, we need to know the rules before we can break them. That's a poor paraphrase of a quote either by Picasso or about Picasso. I can't remember. I should have looked it up before I said it. Anyway, so think about what stories follow this traditional arc and what stories don't. So a lot of the high modernist stories I'm thinking of don't, like a lot of Virginia Woolf's writings, James Joyce, even Faulkner doesn't necessarily follow this story arc. A lot of the modernist authors really challenged the traditional narrative. We've talked about Victorian writing a lot and Romantic writing. And then postmodernism completely disrupts this notion, but now we're kind of getting back to a more traditional story arc. So you can think about what you want to say. Do you want to follow the same pattern or not? Okay, so the last couple of questions. What is plot? This seems like a simple question, but when I ask students to summarize something or say, like, what's the plot of the story, often they struggle with it. So that would be a fair game question to ask you guys, like, just give me a 2-sentence summary of this story. In some stories, it's very easy, but when we get to maybe Faulkner, we're going to read Barn Burning later, it might be a little more difficult. So there are different types of conflict. I call them external and internal conflict. You've probably thought about these or heard them before. External conflict is essentially when something's pressed on a character. So bank robbers would be kidnappers, and it doesn't even have to be that extreme. It can be like a father doesn't let his son or daughter or whatever go to a party. So that would be an external restraint or external cause of conflict. An internal conflict would be just what you think it is. When a character, it's like human versus human. If you've thought about the different landscapes of conflict, human versus nature, human versus human, human versus self. Those are pretty much the big three when it comes to conflict. How do you generate conflict in stories? When do you generate it? And is conflict necessary? In the graduate workshops, this question is often challenged and brought up because some people don't write conflict-heavy stories or really plot-heavy stories, because plot and conflict often go hand in hand. Another cliche. So that's a question that you will have to grapple with, and I would invite you to challenge in your own writing as well. A lot of stories or plays that I'm thinking of more so that don't have conflict are the absurdist plays. So Waiting for Godot, there is conflict, but it's very minimal. They're just basically waiting for this figure named Godot the whole play, and he's supposed to, by Samuel Beckett, and Godot is supposed to represent God, and Godot/God never comes. So he's making a statement about religion and expectation and kind of societal conventions in that. So the conflict there is pretty scarce. A lot of philosophical writings have a, quote, lack of conflict. They're not really as interested in getting readers interested in entertainment quality or value. They are more concerned with generating thought and challenging conventional notions. So that goes back to kind of purpose in your writing. What do you need to say? What do you need to say it? And do you need to say something about, do you need to make a comment about religion, society, the political climate right now? What do you need to say? And how do you generate and when? I would say when is the first page. So especially in a short story, my thesis director and one of the reason why I'm here, Mark Brasidas, he's a master at creating conflict in the first line, essentially, to get the reader interested and trying to figure out what will happen in the story. So you get that engagement immediately. And how do you generate conflict in stories? I've given you a couple of ways with the human versus nature. I'm thinking of The Revenant is a really good example of that. Or anything by Jack London also. Or Frank Norris. He's good conflict creator with nature. Human versus human, external conflict, or human versus self. So think about all of these things as you start writing your own pieces. And again, bring your questions for me for Friday. Bring all of those materials I went over in the first video for Friday. And then go ahead and get your cliche sheet and your discussion board to me/your peers by 11:59 p.m. tonight. And I will see you guys on Friday. Looking forward to reading more of your writing.